Over the last 16 years, Oklahoma State's quietly become one of the best places to be for an offensive coordinator. Kasey Dunn's currently in that position for the Cowboys, but if you look back at the 6 play callers before him, it's an almost unbroken chain of guys who quickly turned success in Stillwater into bigger opportunities. That list includes guys like Larry Fedora, Todd Monken, and Dana Holgorsen, who all left the Cowboys for head coaching positions of their own, as well as more recent coordinators like Mike Yurcich, who now calls plays at Penn State, and Sean Gleeson, who just became the first $1 million coordinator in Rutgers history. Of course, these guys are moving on and up because of the numbers that their units put up on the field, where over the last 16 years, the Cowboys have produced 7 top 10 offenses under 5 different coordinator combinations. The program is clearly a great incubator for offensive talent, and the credit for that has to go to head coach Mike Gundy, who's been the one constant in a decade and a half of outstanding offense. Now, if you're not in the Big 12 footprint, you might best remember Gundy for something like this.
Come after me! I'm a man! I'm 40!
When you dive into his record, though, and look at his hiring history, you quickly see that he's providing the guiding vision behind all of that offensive success, and neither he nor his coordinators are afraid to say it. Most recently, when you promoted Kasey Dunn to coordinator, he made it clear he was calling the shots, saying, "Our offense has been what it is since I was calling plays. Each coordinator I've allowed to add some based on what they're comfortable with." This same sentiments come up in interviews with Dunn himself, as well as with Gleeson and Yurcich, and the common thread is that while Gundy's offensive coordinators are true coordinators and they are the primary play callers, with very few exceptions, they aren't being hired to bring in a brand new system. They're being hired to run Gundy's system at the highest level possible, and so in this video, we'll focus on the development of that system and on the many collaborations that have gotten it to where it was in 2020. Mike Gundy's been a fixture at Oklahoma State for more than 30 years. As a player in the late 80s, he was a prolific passer, setting both school and conference records while throwing for 49 touchdowns and almost 8,000 yards. By the way, his running backs were pretty good too. Right now you're watching him hand off to Barry Sanders, but in previous seasons he also shared a backfield with Hall of Famer Thurman Thomas, so yeah, those offenses were pretty good. The head coach of those Cowboy teams was a man named Pat Jones, and when Gundy graduated in 1990, Jones immediately hired him to be his wide receiver coach. During the early 90s, Gundy worked his way up within the program, and in 94 he got his first crack at the offensive coordinator position. That opportunity wouldn't last long, though. After the 94 season, Jones got fired and was replaced by Bob Simmons, and Simmons brought Les Miles over to replace Gundy as offensive coordinator. Gundy did stick around for a year as a position coach under this new regime, however, and the connection that he made with Miles in this one season would prove vital to him eventually becoming Oklahoma State's head coach. After that one season with Simmons and Miles, Gundy left the Cowboys for a position with more responsibility at Baylor, where he was the Bears' passing game coordinator and quarterback coach. Once again, though, his head coach got fired, causing Gundy to take a job as a position coach at Maryland for a few seasons. His next big break, and the move that brought him back to Oklahoma State for good, came in 2001, when the Cowboys hired Les Miles for a second time, this time to be their head coach. As we saw, Gundy and Miles had worked together during that 1995 season, and Miles was more than happy to bring Gundy back to Stillwater to be his offensive coordinator. Gundy and Miles had some pretty good years together at Oklahoma State, and they're still on great terms, but both men admit that they constantly butted heads over offensive philosophy during this time. Miles was an old-school coach who'd played on the O-line for Bo Schembechler at Michigan, and Gundy was a former record-setting passer who was starting to find inspiration from the spread offenses that were on the rise. As Gundy puts it, those new offensive ideas, quote, would go on deaf ears with less because it didn't involve 2 tight ends and a fullback. That all changed in 2005 when Miles left to become the head coach at LSU. Gundy was promoted to replace him, and all of a sudden he needed to find an offensive coordinator who could help to incorporate those new spread ideas into the Oklahoma State offense. To find that guy, he looked back to his one season at Baylor when he'd worked with a position coach by the name of Larry Fedora. After their year together at Baylor, Fedora got an interesting combination of influences, first spending 2 seasons in Fisher DeBerry's triple option attack at Air Force before becoming an early adopter of a wide-open, up-tempo spread attack all the way back in 1999 when he became the offensive coordinator at Middle Tennessee. As Fedora says, only one other team at the time was even doing that. And really, to place this move within the history of the spread, just remember that in 1999, Chip Kelly just gotten his first coordinator job at New Hampshire, and Urban Meyer was still a wide receiver coach at Notre Dame. So Fedora was an early adopter of this kind of up-tempo spread style of attack. At Oklahoma State, he combined this philosophy with Gundy, who'd been running that power rushing attack under Miles, but was looking to move into more spread concepts, and together they developed what some today might call a power spread or a spread-to-run offense. At its heart, this was an 11 personnel offense, meaning that it spent a lot of the game with 1 running back, 1 tight end, and 3 wide receivers on the field. From that grouping, the Cowboys ran the ball a lot more than they threw it, and they incorporated mobile quarterbacks like Bobby Reed and Zach Robinson into their rushing attack. It's fun to look back at those early offenses because they sit right at the boundary between the I formation and the spread eras, and because of that, they did some things that most current spread teams don't do anymore. For example, while the Cowboys were a big shotgun team back then, there was still room for an under-center run, play action, and rollout series, and the point here is that Gundy didn't just abandon the principles that he'd been using as a play caller under Miles. The Cowboys had been a physical rushing team before, and they were still a physical rushing team. Gundy and Fedora just agreed that spreading the field and incorporating a mobile quarterback was the best way to get that run game going. In a lot of ways, that philosophy was still at the heart of the 2020 offense, but before we get to that, there's one more critical development that we have to talk about in the history of Mike Gundy's offense. Fedora stayed with the Cowboys for 3 seasons before leaving to become the head coach at Southern Mississippi after the 2007 season. Gundy promoted from within the program to replace him, and the offense stayed strong for a year in 2008, but in 2009 it really fell off a cliff and something needed to change. It was at that point that Gundy made what he calls, quote, one of the best coaching moves in the country by going outside of the program to hire air raid guru Dana Holgorsen. Holgorsen deserves a video of his own, but the Cliff Notes version is that he got in on the ground floor of the air raid in the early 90s, first as a player and then as a young assistant, and would later become a longtime assistant for Mike Leach at Texas Tech, coaching wide receivers and serving as Leach's eye in the sky up in the press box, a job that he was apparently incredible at. When Gundy hired him in 2010, Holgorsen had recently stepped out of Leach's shadow to run his own version of the air raid for Kevin Sumlin at Houston, and by the end of just his second season there, he turned the Cougars into the #1 offense in the country and had clearly earned a shot at a bigger program. At that same time, Gundy's Cowboys really didn't have the kind of mobile quarterback that they needed to make his system work. Instead, they had a 27-year-old former baseball player named Brandon Weeden who couldn't run but who was a prototypical pocket passer. Gundy brought Holgorsen on board, the Cowboys started passing 40 times a game, Weeden threw for almost 4,300 yards, and Justin Blackmon led the country in touchdown receptions. Holgorsen only stayed at Oklahoma State for 1 season before moving on to take the head coach position at West Virginia, but a lot of the core passing game that he brought with him is still in place to this day. In Gundy's words, we learned that system, we know it, we have it, and we understand it. Indeed, when you look at Oklahoma State's passing offense 10 years later, you can still see a lot of that air raid influence hanging around. For example, here we're going to see a take on the mesh concept that air raid offenses especially love to run against man coverages. This concept is defined by 2 shallow crosses working from opposite sides of the field and crossing as close to each other as possible in an effort to create traffic for opposing defenders to run through. We can see that at work right here. As those 2 receivers start to work across the field, notice that their defenders are chasing them in man coverage. We can focus especially on this cornerback right here, who's trying to stay with his guy as he works from the bottom of the screen to the top. We won't get a great look at it from this camera angle, but you can imagine that as that defender works toward the middle of the field, the receiver and the defensive back coming from the opposite side are going to create a lot of traffic for him to pick through as he tries to stay with his man. Sure enough, on this play, that creates just enough separation for his receiver. After he clears the mesh point, he's going to bend his route downfield, and his defender will be just a step behind as he picks up the 22-yard reception. Now let's check that out one more time at full speed. On this play from 2020, we'll get a look at the air raid's favorite downfield passing concept, 4 verticals. This concept's exactly what it sounds like. After the snap, the offense just sends 4 receiving threats deep. The Cyclones are only going to end up with 3 deep zone defenders here, and so those 4 receivers are going to give them more than they can handle. After the snap, keep an eye on this robber safety in the middle of the field as he works toward the tight end near the top of the screen, leaving the safety at the bottom of the screen in a 1-on-2 with the opposite tight end and wide receiver. That safety is going to speed turn out to the sidelines to take away the receiver, leaving the seam open for that second tight end. So the question now is, does all of this make Oklahoma State a quote-unquote air raid team? And it's not that simple. While the Cowboys do run a lot of core air raid concepts in the passing game, neither Gundy nor Holgorsen really ever wanted to run a pure Leach-style air raid, and Gundy in particular just wanted to take what was useful from the air raid passing game and layer it on top of what he was already running. This showed up in 2020 in a lot of ways. To start with the stuff that's easy to see, we might note that Oklahoma State was 7th in the country in rushing attempts per game. This emphasis on the run game also impacted personnel, where the Cowboys ran a lot more out of multiple tight end sets, diamond backfields, and other heavier sets of this kind. Now, on the face of it, this isn't all that unique. Lots of air raid-derived offenses nowadays are trying to establish more of a run game, but something that's less obvious, and the thing that really sets Oklahoma State's offense apart from what I saw with the air raid offenses at, say, Oklahoma and USC, is that this emphasis on the run game shows up not just in those heavier packages where you'd expect it, but also in the one-back spread sets that really make up their base offense. And here we can remember that this spread-to-run philosophy goes all the way back to 2005, and the whole thing that Gundy and Fedora were trying to do in the first place. On this play, for example, we see one running back in the pistol and one tight end on the line. On the outside, the wide receivers are showing some really wide splits with all three receivers basically at the numbers or wider, and what this does is it puts a lot of horizontal pressure on the defense. Up at the top of the screen, for example, notice that Iowa State's bumping their linebackers over to the side of the two detached receivers, so they've got two linebackers to the left of center and just one to the right. We can also notice that this linebacker at the top of the screen has walked well out of the box, leaving the Cyclones with just 5 defenders in the core of the formation. This is a great example of how Oklahoma State can use their spread formations to open up the run game. Now that they've got Iowa State shifted up toward the top of the screen, they're going to use that tight end on the line as an extra blocker in the run game, and they're going to use him to attack the edge away from those shifted linebackers. After the snap, he washes his defensive end down to the inside, and the running back's able to bounce it outside and away from all of Iowa State's front defenders into a good amount of space. This is the kind of thing that Oklahoma State emphasizes that I didn't see much of from Oklahoma and USC. When those teams wanted to establish the run, instead of using an inline tight end, they put their extra blocker in the backfield as more of a true blocking back. Oklahoma State runs this kind of thing as well, and for all of these teams, these are run-heavy formations. That's because when you put that extra blocker in the backfield instead of up on the line, you lose him as an immediate vertical threat in the passing game. Oklahoma State doesn't run into that problem when they put their extra blocker on the line, though. On this play, the Cowboys are again in 11 personnel with one running back in the backfield, one tight end on the line, and 3 wide receivers split out wide. On this play, Iowa State wants to get more defenders into the box against the run, and so they're blitzing this wide linebacker from the bottom of the screen, dropping their middle safety into the low hole, and pulling their 2 remaining safeties back to pick up coverage on the outside. What this does, though, is it creates a lot of space right here, and Oklahoma State's going to use their tight end to attack that void. After the snap, he takes a quick 3 steps downfield, plants, and breaks outside into a lot of space with room to run after the catch. He wouldn't have been able to attack that area anywhere near as effectively if he'd been coming out of the backfield instead. What Oklahoma State's really getting out of these 11 personnel sets then is the ability to truly stretch the defense from sideline to sideline with the tight end as a swing player. If the defense wants to pinch inside to defend the run, then he can attack him on the perimeter in the passing game. If they play outside of him to take that away, then they can use him in the run game to attack the middle of the formation instead. And don't forget, the Cowboys still have 2 quick receivers to the opposite side, and if you ignore them, they can still do a lot of damage as well. So these sets really force the defense to defend the whole field while still presenting a strong run game down the middle. And don't forget, when you have the numbers to stress the defense horizontally like this, you can always push that stretch downfield. Remember that 4 verticals play that we saw earlier? That was run out of a 1-back, 2 tight end set that the Cowboys often use in the run game. As you can probably tell from all of this, I really like the basic theory of this offense. The problem for Oklahoma State in 2020 wasn't necessarily offensive design, it was just that the running game that they were leaning on just wasn't consistent enough. Sometimes this was scheme and sometimes it was execution, but the basic problem is that they were 7th in the country in rushing attempts per game, but only 45th in the country in rushing yards per game. The interesting thing here is that they were still pretty explosive on the ground. They just also happened to be one of the worst teams in the country at giving up tackles for loss, and that's really the thing that limited their offensive potential in 2020. Alright, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to click the thumbs up button down below to like it. It really helps get these videos recommended to more people on YouTube so the channel can grow. As for next week, I'm going to be staying in the Big 12 with TCU's 4-2-5 defense under Gary Patterson, so be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell to get notified when it posts, and I'll see you here next time.